really a pleasure to get to talk to historical groups. I've given the talk to many different types of groups, clubs, and retirement homes, but I find that the best audiences are people who are really interested in history of their area. During my talk, anytime you want to raise a hand and interrupt me, feel free to do so, because sometimes the questions are very interesting. I do have, after I give the talk and show slides, I have pictures over here that I could lay out on the table. You people could look at some of the same pictures you'll see on the screen and discuss them. It's fun for me to talk about Lake Washington because that's where I grew up. I learned to dog paddle in Maidenbower Bay in Bellevue, and when I was 6 years old, and then when I was 7, I learned to dive off the dock. And when I was 8 years old, we left Bellevue and moved over to Leshai Park, right by the ferry dock. And that's where I learned to row a boat and paddle a canoe and sail. And I sailed Lake Washington for about 70 years. I don't have a sailboat now. I finally had to give up. I'm a member of 3 historical groups, Bellevue, Mercer Island, and Kane County. And several years ago, our Bellevue chairman came to me and she said, "Norman, didn't your father work on the Lake Washington ferry boats?" I said, "Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, so did my mother." And I said, "I worked on the ferry dock selling newspapers." "Oh," she said, "that sounds interesting." She said, "Would you give our group a talk about growing up on Lake Washington with the ferries?" And I said, "When?" And she said, "Well, not till next spring in April." Oh, and that was October. So I said, "Oh, good, that gives me all winter then to plan my talk and do my research." The first person then that I thought of was Captain Bob Matson. He's the man on the right with the captain. And on the left is his uncle, John Anderson, who owned all but one ferry boat on Lake Washington when I was young and growing up. The only boat that he didn't own was a little steamboat that served the Kirkland area called the Ariel. Does anyone here remember the Ariel? You do, good. Well, it took it was a little passenger steamboat run by the Johnson brothers, and it served the 3 points, Yarrow, Hunts Point, and Evergreen, and it took students over to Garfield High School and Broadway High School. And also it took people whose work was in Seattle. It was easier for them to commute than it was to drive around the lake. So a lot of people rode that little passenger boat. The first person I thought of when I was asked to give my first talk was Captain Bob Matson. Captain Matson worked on Lake Washington and Puget Sound from the time he was 17 years old until he retired at 65. So, and I knew that he had been doing what I've been doing since, giving talks and showing slides of Lake Washington. So I phoned his house, and his wife answered the phone, and I told her who I was and why I wanted to talk to Bob. And she said, "Oh, Norman, I'm sorry, but Bob died 2 years ago." So he's probably been gone about 16 years. I already told that story, so you can take it on. We didn't get much time to rehearse for this talk, so I'm apologizing for it. But Bob Matson was a member of the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society. And he, I think, was one of the founders. And they have a publication called The Sea Chest. So when I talked to his wife, she said, if you would go to the Museum of History and Industry out by the Montlake Cut, she said, a lot of Bob's stories are written up in the sea chest, and they have the copies. Well, since then, I've been able to acquire about 100 copies of the sea chest that I'm very proud of. The reason that Bob Matson had so much information was because when his uncle, Captain Anderson, passed away, he willed all of his memorabilia and all of his stories to his nephew. Captain Anderson didn't have children, and he more or less treated Bob Matson like a son. Captain Anderson not only owned the boats on Puget Sound, but he also owned the biggest park, and that was called Fortuna Park on the east side of Mercer Island on the East Channel. And besides that, he owned the Lake Washington Shipyard, which is here in Kirkland. It's now Caroline Point, and he made a lot of boats at his shipyard. But his Fortuna Park was quite an interesting place. It was every weekend there were groups that reserved the park for themselves. I can think of 3 groups that I remember going over to Mercer Island. The Rainier Valley Italians always had a big picnic during the summer over at Fortuna Park. Another group were the Masons and the Shriners. And also the butchers from Seattle. We children in the neighborhood looked forward to those big picnics because Captain Anderson would use his steamboat called the Aquilo, and he would start taking people from Seattle over to Mercer Island to the park. And over there they would picnic, party, dance, and drink. And they had a big dance pavilion. The dance pavilion is still there. It's used by a retirement community. Many of you may know Covenant Shores. And I gave my talk at Covenant Shores several years ago. And a lot of them didn't even know that that used to be called Fortuna Park. When those party people that had been drinking and dancing and having a ball all day, when they came in back to Seattle in the late afternoon, we kids in the neighborhood would dive into the lake, swim out to welcome them back, and we would holler nickel, dime, quarter. And these picnickers would toss money into the water, and we would dive for coins. And on a good weekend, some of us made as much as $3 on Saturday and Sunday diving for money. And during the Depression, $3 was a lot of spending money for a kid. But now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of my early life. As far as I know, I'm the only person living who was born in a house on Main Street in downtown Bellevue. My mother was pregnant with me the last months of World War I. And after the armistice in November, it got close for the time for me to be born. The doctor came to our house and he said, "Mrs. Bly, there are no beds available in the hospitals in Seattle." Of course, Bellevue, Kirkland, Mercer Island, Issaquah, there were no hospitals over here. If you wanted to have a tonsil taken out in the hospital, you had to go to Seattle. And he said, even if there was a bed available, he said, "I think the trip is too strenuous for you. It would mean getting transportation from Bellevue to Medina, catch the ferry over to Seattle, then arrange transportation to the Providence or Swedish hospital." He said, "Why don't we just plan on delivering the child right here at home?" So I was born on Main Street in Bellevue. I think my first ferry boat ride, I was probably 18 months old, and my mother had to carry me on in her arms. And I rode the ferry Leshai from Medina over to Leshai, where the cable car would take us to downtown Seattle. The first 20 years of my life, I spent 10 of it in Seattle and 10 of it in Bellevue. And the reason is that I lived in both places twice. When I was 8 years old, 1927, my dad bought a service station right near the Leshai ferry dock. And this was the first mobile station. It had the first number in the state of Washington. I was quite surprised to learn that when one of the mobile representatives came down, he said, "Oh, your station 101001. That is the first number that was issued to a mobile station in the area." You can see one of the old cars there in front of the building. But I used to sit and eat my breakfast looking out those windows and watch the ferry boats coming in from Medina and Mercer Island. When I was about 11, I took over the newspaper stand at the Leshai ferry dock. And I would sell newspapers to the people that came down via cable car down the Yesler Way and boarded the ferry to go to either Mercer Island or Medina. And I would sell it to the walk-on passengers. And besides that, I would walk up the lines of cars and sell papers to the drivers and the passengers. And my most famous customer was Miller Freeman. Now you people may know that name. You may remember Kemper Freeman Jr. Well, at that time, Kemper Freeman wasn't born. His dad, though, was going to the University of Washington, and I used to see Kemper Freeman Sr. come from the university and go cross over to Medina. When I'm talking about a service station, I think it's kind of funny to tell the story. Gas was 21 cents for a long time, and then there was a gas war, and it got down to 16 cents. And I was taking art in high school, and my dad said to my brother, he said, "Well, Norman's an artist," he said, "have him paint us a 10-cent sign for gas." So I painted this sign on a metal, the new numbers on a metal sign that swung back and forth, and swung back and forth. I knew she'd catch that. But I never sold the papers directly to Miller Freeman. Miller Freeman had a Lincoln limousine, and he was always in the back seat. And I would sell the newspaper to his chauffeur, Charlie, and he would pay me and then hand the newspaper back from the back seat to Miller. And when I studied the history of Mercer Island and about the floating bridges, I found out that Miller Freeman was the main spark plug behind getting that Mercer Island bridge built. He was a publisher, and he published magazines up and down the West Coast. When I sold papers on the ferry dock, there were two boats that served Mercer Island. One was a little steamboat called the Dawn, and I'm going to tell you a lot more stories about the Dawn later on. And it served the west side of Mercer Island, and it took passengers only. The other ferry was the steamer Mercer, and that was an automobile ferry. And it docked at Roanoke, and people would drive across Mercer Island and catch the boat at Roanoke. Kirkland was served by the Lincoln from Madison Park, and that was the biggest car ferry on the lake. The Lincoln was. Reading stories that Bob Matson had written, I could tell 4 or 5 about the Lincoln, but I'm just going to tell you my favorite story. Many of you historians may remember that years ago, back in the late 20s and 30s, there was a hog farm up on Rose Hill east of Kirkland. It was called the Moffett Hog Farm. And Mr. Moffett had I believe it was a dump truck, and he had a contract with several hotels and restaurants in Seattle. And he would, twice a week, I believe, he would send his driver over to Seattle, make the rounds of the hotel, and pick up all of their table scraps. And that was a win-win situation because the hotels got a free pickup of their waste, and he got free hog feed for his hogs. Well, one winter evening, this truck had made the rounds and it was full of hog feed. He drove down Madison and boarded the ferry to come to Kirkland. And he drove aboard, and He liked to put his truck in the middle of the boat because of the weight of it. And I've been telling this story wrong, and I reread the article, and I found out that he did not, they didn't block his truck. He just put his truck in gear when he drove aboard. So, like many people, as they crossed Lake Washington in this deep fog, he went upstairs for a cup of coffee. Well, out in the middle of the lake, the captain of the Lincoln thought he saw something in the water in the fog ahead. So he signaled his engineer full steam in reverse. And the Lincoln slowed down, and as he approached it, he realized that there was nothing in the water. It was just an optical illusion. That remains of her stores. This lady owned optical illusion eyeglasses stores. But anyway, then he signaled the engineer full steam ahead. And in a few minutes they docked in Kirkland, and the driver came down, and there was no truck there. It had backed, when he went full steam ahead, the truck had backed off the ferry. And right out in the middle of the lake, I understand that 3 weeks later that they were able to send the diver down, and they did retrieve the truck. I don't know how they were able to do it. Yes?
About the hog farm, a person that lived here in town for many, many years as a young boy of 12, he followed the truck up to the farm, and he found that the busboys in the restaurants in Seattle had just scraped everything off the tables, including some of the cutlery and other things. And we actually have some of that cutlery downstairs in our archives that we recovered from the hog farm.
I was going to tell that story next. Thank you. Yes, one lady, when I gave the talk to a group, she said, "Oh, I remember the hog farm. They never had to buy any tableware because they got enough from the garbage." I was thinking that that trip, the hogs didn't get fed, but the fish must have had a good feed. Besides these commuter boats, the most profitable run that Captain Anderson had was on the steamer, the Atlanta. The Atlanta left Leschi, it ran only in the summer months, and it left Leschi at 10:30 in the morning, would go down the lake to Madison Park, out to Sandpoint where it turned around, then it would go through the Lake Washington Ship Canal and to the government locks at Ballard, and then out around West Point and into Elliott Bay where it docked for an hour or two and then made the return trip. I mentioned that my mother had also worked on the ferries. This is the boat that my mother worked on. She had the lunch counter. It was right about here. It was about as big as half of this table, and it was hinged at one end. She would lift the table up, the board up, and get to this. Is that better? And she'd go into a little cubby hole where she had. She had a coffee urn in there and a breadboard, and she sold mostly sandwiches and coffee, but she also had soda pop and Hershey bars and chewing gum things. Remember, she came home quite excited. Can somebody move this thing? I must have bumped the trigger. Is it all right? The people in the back are waving like
Testing, 1, 2. No. Testing, 1, 2, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
We're just getting started. I'm not sure what kind of invitation.
I remember she came home one day quite excited. She said, "I just had my biggest gross day. I took in $14. Well, during the Depression, probably 6 or 7 of that was profit. And that was pretty good wages for a woman in those days. Because she didn't have a lot of patronage, she had a lot of spare time on her hands. And in her spare time, she always had a novel to read. My mother was a great reader. And so a man came up and ordered a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and she laid her book down and made a sandwich, and he looked over the counter and he said, "Oh, I see you're reading Peter B. Kind's latest novel." She said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, how do you like it?" She said, "Well, I've read several of his books, and I don't care for this. I think it's the poorest thing he's done." So he paid for his sandwich and left, and pretty soon a woman came up and ordered a sandwich and coffee. And after she paid for it, she turned to my mother and she said, "I'm glad you told my husband you didn't like his dumb book." I think her face was still red when she got home. This is a picture of my mother. That was about the time that she had that counter. Okay. How's that? Oh, that's better. Yes. Yes, that was my mother. I think was in her 30s maybe when she had that lunch counter. But go ahead and switch it to number 6. The next is a picture of the steamer, the Fortuna. Now that's the same name as Fortuna Park, and I never have found out whether the park was named after the boat or the boat was named after the park. But that's the boat that my dad worked on first. And it circled Mercer Island, ran down the west side and stopped at all the docks, and then went around the island and came up the East Channel, making stops all the way along. My dad never did work on the steamer Mercer. He was a purser on the Fortuna, but it would have been fun to say that he was a purser on the Mercer. I like the sound of that. In the late 20s, my dad decided that he was tired of working on the ferries, so he was going to spend full time running our service station, which he did for a while. And then he decided to lease it out to my 2 older brothers. And we had to rent a house then at Leschi when he went back to work on the steamer Leschi. When we were living at Leschi, we were paying rent. And when we moved from Bellevue, we still had a 4-bedroom house right in the heart of Bellevue. So he said, "Well, this isn't very good business to pay rent in Seattle when we have an empty house in Bellevue." So that's why I lived in Bellevue twice. He decided to move back to Bellevue and board the ferry at Medina. Well, that was when I was in about the 7th grade, and I was still taking music lessons in Seattle. And to get to my music lesson, I had to I was taking banjo lessons. I carried my banjo down from our home, down into the heart of Bellevue, caught the bus for a dime over to Medina, and there I boarded the Leschi ferry to Leschi, and transferred to a cable car down to 3rd and Yesler, where our King County Courthouse is. Then I transferred to a trolley to go up to Union Street and take my music lesson. And then in the late afternoon or evening, I would have to make the return trip. That was quite a trip for a 12-year-old. But the fun part of it was going home. Sometimes the captain of the paddle wheel boat, Leschi, would ask me to come up in the pilot house and play my banjo as we crossed the lake. And sometimes they would say, "Well, do you want to steer for a while, Norman?" And I said, "Sure." So I got to steer the paddle boat, steamboat, the Leschi, across the lake. That was a big steering wheel, I remember. 1941, steamboats and paddle wheels were going out of style, and diesel was the new thing. So Captain Anderson took the old steamboat Leshai out of service. He took it over to his shipyard here in Kirkland and changed it from a paddle wheel boat to a diesel powered. And at that time, my dad was working on the Leshai boat, and when the new diesel was launched, they had a grand inaugural trip, and my mother and I were invited to go on the first. Oh, that's the wrong picture. That's the diesel. Okay. I was going to have the steamboat first. Anyway, this is a picture of the new diesel-powered ferry, the Leshai. The old ferry had a great big high stack, and a lot of the celebrities that were on the boat had their watches out. And the old time with the paddle wheels, the crossing was 15 minutes. The diesel made it in 11 and a half. And that was a little time saving, but the main thing was that they were able to remove the big paddle wheel boxes on the deck, and they could put almost twice as many cars on this new ferry as they could the old one because of the big paddle wheel interference. And that's a picture, as it says, a picture of my dad standing on the deck. Captain Anderson. I showed you one picture of Captain Anderson. This is another one. And I'll tell you a little about his life. Captain Anderson was born in Sweden in 1868, and when he was 14 years old, he got a job on his uncle's lumber and ore boat going to Canada. Well, on his second trip over, he became very ill and was left in a hospital in Quebec City. He stayed in Canada for a couple of years and worked for one of the Canadian railroads. And finally, though, he missed going to sea, so he came down to Seattle. How he got down here, I don't know. But when he was 20 years old, he was working on Elliott Bay on the waterfront. He made trips as far as Alaska and California from Elliott Bay on our waterfront. But when he was 20, he heard about a new boat being built on Lake Washington by a land developer on Mercer Island. The land developer was C.C. Calkins. You want to put that one on now? This was the boat that Calkins was building. He owned a big piece of property on the west side of Mercer Island that he called East Seattle. And to serve that, and he built a 3-story hotel there, a beautiful big wooden building. And he knew that if that hotel and if the real estate was going to make a go of it, he needed good ferry service. So that's why he decided to build his own boat and to serve Mercer Island. Captain Anderson heard about that C.C. Calkins' new boat was looking for a deckhand, and he thought, gee, I'd sure like to work on Lake Washington. And so he decided to apply for the job, and the boat wasn't quite finished yet, but he boarded the Esther cable. That was 1888, and I was surprised to learn that that was the first year the cable car operated. But anyway, he went up and down all these hills, and I rode those cable cars all of my young life until they quit running. When he broke over the hill at 30th Avenue, it was a beautiful day, and he could see Medina, Mercer Island, the Cascades, and all of this beautiful lake. And he had worked in Seattle for 2 years and had never seen Lake Washington. That was quite a surprise, but in those days, before that, they didn't have cable cars. That's the hotel. This is the hotel that C.C. Calkins built. He came from back east, and he was a big money man. Okay, that's there. I keep letting go of this thing. This hotel had quite a history. It was a beautiful building for its time, and in 1891, President Benjamin Harrison came to Seattle for a visit, and he planned to spend the night at the new big hotel on Mercer Island. Well, the captain of the C.C. Calkins boat was George Rogers. His brother was the engineer, Frank Rogers. Frank Rogers was not only the engineer, but he was a musician. And so when the boat was being built, young Frank Rogers asked Calkins to build a calliope, a steam calliope on the upper deck of that boat that I just showed. So anyway, when President Benjamin Harrison came to Seattle, he rode the steamer, the Kirkland, for a tour of the lake. And Calkins knew he was going down to Madison Park, so they went down there and had the steam up. And when President Benjamin Harrison arrived, Frank Rogers was at the Calliope playing Home Sweet Home and Yankee Doodle Dandy in honor of President Benjamin Harrison. Then in 1893, there was a terrible depression, and the hotel, the patronage went way down. Times were tough, and so that hotel went from a luxury hotel to a boarding house. Then it became a sanitarium, and it had several different owners. But finally, the end of it came in 1908, when a young boy was scolded for a boy that worked there, a houseboy was scolded. He was mad, and to get even with the company, he went up on the roof of that big hotel, stuffed oily rags down the chimney, and tossed a match in and got the fire started. And I've heard that you could see that fire for 50 miles up, way up Puget Sound. They could see that hotel burning. Going back to Captain Anderson. Going back to Captain Anderson, he wanted that job real bad, and C.C. Calkins wanted someone with saltwater experience to be a deckhand on his new boat. So he hired young Anderson, and when he was 20 years old. Well, he was a deckhand for 2 years, and then he became captain. The reason that he got to be captain was that the musician, Frank Rogers, the engineer, was killed in a hunting accident at Lake Sammamish. Well, his brother George was brokenhearted. They were very close, and so he didn't want to be captain of the Calkins anymore, so he gave up the job. Anderson had been working on the boat for 2 years and knew everything about it, so he took the test, and at the age of 22, young Anderson was captain of that excursion boat. Then the depression got real bad, and they had to quit operating the Calkins, and the hotel burned down. So then while Anderson was captain, he was a thrifty Swede. He saved $1,500, and he became friends with a skipper called Jimmy Coleman. And I believe the Coleman Dock is part of that Coleman family, the Coleman Dock in Seattle. He gave young Coleman the $1,500. Coleman owned 2 boats, the Winifred and the Dixon, and they put the $1,500 into improving the Winifred. They increased her speed, and they did a lot of improvements on the boat. When it was finished, they invited the people from Newcastle down towards Renton to go on a moonlight excursion on their new boat. So they had a wonderful evening. They toured Lake Washington, and finally ended up dancing at Madrona Park. Well, then they returned the passengers, and the boat steamed across to Leschi and tied up for the night. And the two men were very excited about their new boat and which was going to be their new route. Well, that night the boat caught fire and burned to the water line. So the steamer, the Winifred, only made one trip and it was gone. Fortunately, these two men were well insured, so each one of them went into business for himself. And that's when Captain Anderson really got started in the boat building business and boat operating business. I could go on now forever telling you how many boats Anderson built and how many he owned, but that gets pretty boring, so I'm just going to tell you a few stories about the experiences on the lake. What's next? Yeah. Because you people are historians, you no doubt know that Lake Washington used to be 9 feet deeper than it is now. And when it was deeper, it was possible to bring boats up the Duwamish River from Elliott Bay and then into the Black River and into Lake Washington. Well, that wasn't easy. And the man that first started doing that was a man called Frank Gilbert. And I'm happy to see Anita Maxwell here today. Frank Gilbert was her great uncle. And she phoned me several years ago and said, Norman, did you ever know Frank Gilbert? And I said, did I know him? I said, everybody on Lake Washington knew Frank Gilbert. He was the #1 skipper on the lake. But before he was a well-known skipper, he would work towing boats up the Duwamish River, then the Black River, and into Lake Washington. And he said they had to wait for a high tide and they had to wait for a flood to get the river deep enough to pull the boats up. And one of the remarks he made, he said they used stump pullers and they used Indians and they even used horses to pull the boats up over the sandbars. And Gilbert said that when you're up to your neck in water trying to tie a boat around a rope around a stump, he said, in it's ice cold water, he said, that's a hell of a way to make a living. He was a tough guy. I lived near Renton and in Renton for a long time, for 60 years. And it wasn't until I started doing these talks and reading all the history that I found out that the Cedar River that runs right through our city under our library is man-made. I thought that that was the Cedar River's route, but the Cedar River used to run right through Renton. And one time the reservoir up in the Cascade foothills broke, and the Cedar River just flooded Renton, and the headlines in the paper said that Renton was flooded and Seattle didn't have any water. I think I'm going to skip the Canal chapter. Number 16. Yeah, I'm not going to. Oh, after they dug the Cedar River channel through Renton and lowered the lake, the Black River dried up and disappeared. And this is a picture of them canoeing on the old Black River, and down below is a picture of the McDonald's restaurant on Rainier Avenue. It's the one that burned about 2 years ago. It burned up, and so the McDonald's is no longer there. But these people in the canoes could go down the Black River and merge with the Duwamish and end up in Seattle. Now, I want to talk about the building of the Lake Washington Ship Canal. Way back in 1854, Thomas Rusher and some of the pioneers in Seattle said, someday we have to connect Puget Sound with Lake Washington, and that means digging a canal or drilling a hole through Beacon Hill, which they even talked about. But finally they decided on the route that we now know as the Lake Washington Ship Canal that starts at over by Laurelhurst and goes by the stadium and into Portage Bay and Lake Union. And So it took 55 years for them to get started on that. And in 1911, that's when they started digging the Ballard locks. It took 5 years for them to finish it. And in 1916, it was navigable, and they could run boats through it in the spring. But they didn't have the grand opening until the 4th of July of 1916. And that's when they brought a famous boat called Roosevelt, and that was the boat that Admiral Perry took to discover the North Pole. He led the parade through on the grand opening. That was that was 4th of July of 1917. And in April, just before that, the United States got into World War I. And that was just a little while before I was born. That picture that is on the screen shows when they opened the canal to the Montlake Cut. And when I gave this talk to a group of businessmen several years ago, one of the men said, Norm, he said, how long did it take Lake Washington to drop 9 feet after they opened up? And I didn't know. I said, yeah, I've never been asked that question and I've never read it. But I said, I'm sure going to find out. So the next week, my wife and I and my son were out at the Ballard Locks. I went into the information museum there, and the man at the desk, I said, can you tell me how long it took? And he said, gee, I'm from Spokane, I don't know. But he said, give me your name and address and I'll send you that information. We have it all on our computer. So it was only 2 days later I went out the mailbox and here was a big envelope, and I found out that it took 4 months for the water to trickle from Lake Washington into the canal and drop down to the level of Lake Union. And I did a little arithmetic and I found out it was about an inch a day the lake went down until it reached the level of Lake Union. My wife and I were down at Sword Park a couple of summers ago, and there were a group of people picnicking behind us. We were watching the Blue Angels fly over that area, and I was talking to the ladies and I said, gee, if we'd have been here 90 years ago, we would have seen Lake Washington dropping an inch a day to come to the level of Lake Union. Of course, they'd never heard that. They were from another state. Yeah.
Excuse me?
Yes.
There's a story that I read, I'm pretty sure it's true, I think I read it in the Times, where they named Lake Union because they said one day, once upon a time, there will be a union between like Washington
Right.
and the Sound.
Yes, I read that too. Yes, that's right.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to put the next picture in. Several years ago, a Times reporter that covered the east side heard that I was going to give a talk on Mercer Island, and she said, oh, I would like to interview you and have your picture taken for the paper. Well, I was flattered, and so I met the man down at Renton at Coulon Park, and he took this picture. But what I didn't realize that he also took a picture of the Dawn, this little steamer that I'm going to talk about. The rest of my talk will mostly be about the Dawn. I was so glad that when the picture came out that the Dawn was in. Now Frank Gilbert, you can just see his silhouette sitting on the bow of the Dawn. And also I got a copy of your current newsletter, and of course you all saw his picture on the cover, Anita Maxwell's great uncle. I'm going to show the next one. Yeah, you can put that one. This next picture is a picture of Captain Bob Matson, the man that wrote so many of the stories that I tell. He was such a wonderful writer. I just love to read his stories. And he was trained as a kid by Captain Frank Gilbert. And the three people I like to talk about are Captain Anderson that owned the boats, Captain Gilbert that had all those years of operating the boats, and young Bob Matson, who started at the age of 17 working on the boats. Frank Gilbert was Bob Matson's mentor and trained him. Picture of the Dawn. You should go.
Did you not do it?
I know you don't. I'll show it later.
Where was this picture taken at?
This one, yeah, I was just going to say, that's the old Medina ferry dock, and then now it's the Medina City Hall, and the police station is in that building. We would take the bus from Bellevue to Medina, and the family Dahlgrens ran the little restaurant. There was just a little lunch counter there, but it gave you a place to use the restroom and to buy a sandwich or have a cup of coffee while you were waiting for the Leshai ferry to come in. A lot of people don't realize that Medina has never had much industry, and Mercer Island had never had much industry. So the people that lived in Medina, most of them worked in Seattle. And there was no high school in Medina, so the students that lived there had to commute via the Leshai ferry to Seattle and then take the cable car up to Garfield High School. And so now I'm going to tell about the steamer, the Dawn. A Mercer Island woman from a pioneer family wrote about the little steamer Dawn. She said it was segregated into 3 parts. The inside cabin was for women and young children. The outside and the upper deck was for the teenagers going to Garfield High School. The engine room was for men. These seats in the engine room were the men's property and their smoking section. Most of the affairs of the island were settled in that warm, oil-smelling, smoke-filled little room. She said that Ferry Dawn was not only their transportation, it was Mercer Island's city hall. I thought that was kind of cute. A little story about Frank Gilbert and Bob Matson. During Prohibition, Bob wrote that he said, we always knew when one of our patrons was getting a delivery. And of course, you know what that was during Prohibition. He said 2 gallons came aboard for a certain doctor on Mercer Island. So he said to Frank Gilbert and me, he said, don't you boys forget to stop by my place tonight. So on our last run, we took 15 or 20 minutes to go up to his house for peach brandy and social conversation. As Anita knows, Frank Gilbert never turned down a drink, but he had never had an accident. He had a wonderful record as skipper of the boats on Lake Washington. Bob Matson started there when he was, like I said, when he was 17 years old, and his uncle paid him $1 a day wages. He was still going to Garfield High School. And he wrote so many wonderful stories, but I'm going to tell you 3 or 4. One of the stories I like is how the people boarding that little steamer, the Dawn, would come down the muddy paths carrying their dress shoes and wearing a pair of old boots or galoshes, and then they would change shoes on the boat, leave their dirty shoes on the boat all day, and then at night they'd come back from the office and catch the ferry home and change shoes. Bob said that lots of times they took the whistle and they could see people running down to the dock, still trying to finish a cup of coffee and eating a piece of toast. Bob said that there were 14 lanterns on this little boat, and it was his job to keep them clean. And they would loan the lanterns to the passengers on a real foggy or a real bad night that they would carry up the paths to. Nobody had flashlights in those days, so. Sometimes they would buy their tickets by the week or month, and when one of the passengers would run out of tickets, he'd say, I'll owe you one. And he said, we never lost any money. He said they always paid. And quite often Frank Gilbert would see a bunch of high school kids on the dock. He wouldn't even make a complete stop. He would just slow the boat down, and the kids were agile enough to jump aboard, and he could steam off without even making a complete stop. one story I think Bob liked to tell and wrote. One Saturday afternoon, they were getting ready to leave for Mercer Island, and down the stairs at the dock at Leshai came a golfer carrying his clubs. And it was obvious, the people on the boat said, man, he's had a snoot full. He could hardly walk and carry his clubs. So he staggered across the dock, and he missed his footing, and overboard he went. And one of the crew yelled, man overboard, throw him a life preserver. And he yelled back, to hell with me, save my golf clubs. Bob said they didn't save his clubs, they found his bag, but they didn't get his clubs. And then Bob wrote that a lot of you people probably don't know that Maidenbower Bay in Bellevue was the home of a whaling fleet. And Bob was on his last trip, and he was still going to school. They docked at Leshai, and as they pulled into the dock, the night watchman ran down the stairs, and he says, don't tie up. He said, there's a whaling boat on fire over in Bellevue in Maidenbower Bay. You have to go and rescue it. And Gilbert said, okay, Bob, let's go. And Bob said, I have to go to school in the morning. Take Mackenzie with you. Well, Mackenzie was a pioneer on Mercer Island, and he had a jug of wine and a guitar. And Gilbert said that all the way across to Bellevue through that awful fog, he could hear Mackenzie playing Red River Valley and drinking wine all the way over it. But they were able to hook onto that whaleboat and pull it away from the dock, or it would have burned the dock and the 4 or 5 other boats along with it. I've told enough stories that are funny, but now I'm going to close with telling you 2 terrible tragedies that happened on the lake. You know, those boats ran for about 75 years, and coincidentally, the 2 worst accidents they ever had on the boats happened just 6 months apart, happened at the same dock, and at night after dark. The first accident happened, there was a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Henry Manny, and they lived on Hunts Point, and they were going to a dinner party in Seattle, so it was between the holidays. It was the 29th of December. Mr. Manny was the last car aboard the Leshai ferry. They crossed the lake and docked, and they came down from having coffee upstairs, got in the car, and he stepped on the starter, and it wouldn't start. So he said to his wife, he said, I have a crank under the back seat, I'll crank it, you get behind the wheel. So she scooted over behind the wheel, he got the crank out, and of course the engine was still warm. They'd only crossed Lake Washington. The first pull of the crank, the motor started, and she inadvertently had the car in reverse. She backed up so hard that she broke the safety chain and went off into 45 feet of ice-cold water. And 29th of December, it was pretty cold. He screamed at her to jump, and she couldn't get out, and he dove in after her, and pretty soon one of the crew came down and saw Mr. Manny in the water, and he said, what's going on? He said, my car's down there, and my wife is in it. Well, she drowned. And when I gave this talk on Mercer Island at Covenant Shores, I gave it to a men's breakfast club there, and 5 women came and sat at one of the back tables. They weren't invited, but they wanted to hear my talk. So afterwards, this one lady that I'd gone to school with came up and she said, oh, Norman, she said, I enjoyed your talk, but she said, you made a serious mistake. And of course, when you're telling history, you don't want to be incorrect. I said, well, Mern, what did I say? She said, well, Mrs. Henry Manny couldn't have drowned because Henry Manny and his wife were my parents' best friends. I knew Mrs. Manny. My parents went on trips with them. They played bridge together, and they were good friends. I said, well, Mern, I said, that story came from a pretty reliable historian. I said, I'll send you a copy of it. Well, the next day my phone rang and I answered it, and she said, Norm, this is Mern. I owe you an apology. She said, I didn't know there were 2 Mrs. Mannys. The first Mrs. Manny drowned, like you said, that was when she was only 8 years old and I was 8 years old. And she said, Henry Manny remarried. and that was his wife that she knew. So I felt better, and I thought, well, I didn't make a mistake after all. The next story was the following summer of 28. That first story was 27, and then in July 23rd of 1928, a Japanese family had been to a party and had dinner with their friends in Seattle. And when they were going back to Bellevue, to their home, they came down the hill to the ferry boat, and there were lines of cars to cross. Mr. Suda was the family name. Mr. Suda didn't get in line to pay his fare. He went around all the cars, went right on the empty boat, drove across the deck, and he had a Model T Ford with 9 people in it. He hit the safety chain so hard at the end of the dock that this Ford touring car did a complete somersault, and the whole family and friends, 9 people, went down to, off. Well, 3 of them, the older sister and brother, could swim. In my first grade class here, a third of our students were Japanese. A lot of people don't realize how many Japanese we had in Bellevue. But this is a picture of me with the big overalls, and this is Minoru Suda, and it was his dad that drove the car that went into the lake, and he drowned. So he and I we went through 2 grades together. But his sister and older brother lived, and so the next picture now, Judy Lang helped me, and I brought this Japanese lady to a talk in Redmond, and Judy Lang had our picture taken. So there, this lady is Mrs. Paul Horiyuchi. Her husband is a world famous artist, and he passed away about 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
But Bernadette Horiyuchi is still living. She's 94, and we still get together with her and have lunch occasionally.
Her son.
Oh yeah, and standing next to her is her son. He's quite a famous singer. He sings light opera in Seattle. But anyway, she's had a wonderful life in spite of being an orphan when she was 13 or 14 years old. And I think I've told enough stories. Is there any questions anybody has?
Wow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Usually I have pictures spread out on the table, but we were late getting here. The traffic was terrible. I had never driven on Lake Street at 6 o'clock. We did.
Now we know.
Would like to make a comment.
Yes.
Dorothy Daly here. She just stand up. Stand up. Oh. She actually went one time with her friend to go get the hog, take the run on the West Side. Want to tell about it?
Oh, yeah. There were two hog families up there. One was Moffat and the other was Dunkel. Thank you. Anyway, he was in ill health, and my neighbor got to be a really good friend with Olga, who cooked on the Lincoln and the West Side. Anyway, so my neighbor offered to drive the truck and asked me to go along with her. So we made one of the trips to the restaurants and picked up the smell of garbage and came back on the ferry boat. It was quite an experience.
Add a light touch to your story here on the ferries. That was the only, I used to take to work to Seattle every day. And, you remember Olga?
Yes, I know the name, yes.
She was a heavy-set Norwegian woman, the jolliest person you ever saw. And she was always laughing. And one day I went on the ferry and sat down, got my cup of coffee and sat down at the bench, and she was busy there, and all of a sudden she turned and looked at me and started laughing, just breaking out into hysterics. And she was pointing at my shoes. And pretty soon everybody on the ferry was looking at my shoes. And I had one brown shoe and one black shoe.
You have another pair like that at home?
Yeah, I bought a pair of rubbers. It was a bright, sunshiny day, but I bought a pair of rubbers.
Hey, Stan, was that the story that ended up in the East Side Journal? It's in the East Side Journal Index then, about brown shoes?
No, it was his father. I think it was his family.
Yeah.
I think it was a family thing.
I had quite a surprise the first time I gave the talk here in the stroke group. I told the audience, I said, I still remember very vividly my first trip to Kirkland. I said when I was 4 years old, I cut my right foot severely. And we had no doctor in Bellevue at that time. The doctor that delivered me either had retired or died. And so my uncle had a brand new 23 Chev. And my mother yelled at my older brother and sister, go get Uncle Bill. We have to go to Kirkland to a doctor. So I said I can still remember that drive along Overlake Golf Course. It wasn't built then, but that road and then into Kirkland. And I said my uncle carried me up the stairs on Front Street to the doctor's office. As soon as I said that, the whole audience looked down in the front row at this time and they were all smiling. I said, why is everybody looking at this man? And they said, well, that's Dr. McKibben. It was his father, Dr. McKibben, that had sewed up your foot. And all those years, 75 or so years, I didn't know the name of the doctor that had sewed up my foot. And is he still living? Was Dr.
Yes.
He's retired up in Redmond at Emerald Heights. Yes.
He was born in 1922.
He was born in 22.
In 1920.
20. I see.
Also.
Yeah. So he's a little younger than I am.
Yeah. He had, when he was born, they had to go to Seattle too for the hospital.
Yes, I suppose. It may have turned, that cut foot may have turned out to be a blessing because when Pearl Harbor happened, I was drafted. I was going to the University of Washington. I was drafted real early. And they kept redrafting me and turning me down because of that foot. And then during the war, I met this young lady. And if I'd have been in the Army, I would have ever gotten married to my wonderful wife. So it was sort of a blessing. Pardon?
So what do you need soda?
Anybody else? Yes?
Well, I think anybody who lived in Kirkland in 45, from that time on, when they had the old Davis Hospital, I know my husband was delivering groceries for the Red and White store, and he was over in Seattle, and I was very pregnant, and he kept calling me, and I said, not yet. And finally he called me from Ferry and left the truck full of groceries on the ferry and ran up to the hospital. And somebody had to come and get the red and white truck out. And I'm sure that everybody who lived in Kirkland at that time had that kind of a story.
Born in the hospital.
Why did the Kirkland Ferry quit running?
I remember a date of 1950, and Captain Matson, who I showed the picture of, he sold the last ticket And the man that bought that ticket had a name pronounced just like mine. His name was Bligh, but he spelled it like Captain Bligh, B-L-I-G-H. And he was the last passenger on the Leshak ferry going to Madison. Yes?
I was talking to my friend Ella Johnson today, and her mother, I think, worked the last 5 years of the ferry cooking, Carolina Johnson. And she said, yeah, it was, because she thought it was 52 also, and I just read that it was 1950, so I'd forgotten.
They took the Leshak ferry after they had the bridge built, then they took the Leshak down, and it took the place of the Lincoln. And I don't know how many years it was on the run, but there was quite a bit of ferry traffic during the war because the shipyards in Kirkland hired people from Seattle, and so they commuted over to.
They also commuted over to San Point from Kirkland.
Oh,
Yeah. My aunt used to take that.
In that book, there's a picture of Frank on the last trip. They were going to stop it in January and then give it a reprieve until April. And then Chicken of the Sea bought the Leshak trip to Alaska. Then they redid the entire Leshak and had a great big sleeping quarters and a restaurant for the workers and that. Then they sunk it up in the waters of Alaska.
Oh.
Can I ask you a question about over in the Museum of History and Industry? Do they have a lot of records of the whaling times over there?
I don't know. I've been through it several times, through the museum, but I've never heard anything about it.
I know both of my grandfathers took a few trips up there. Kind of a depression, I guess.
I remember in Bellevue, the man that owned the whaling boats that moored in Bellevue, his name was Shoup, and we always referred to him as the millionaire, because he was the only millionaire in Bellevue at the time. When I was about 7 years old, living in Bellevue, my playmate, his grandparents lived next door to him, and they had a big balcony on the second floor of their home, and he had a lot of toys, probably given to him by his grandparents, and they had a big chalkboard, and so that was a place that I could practice writing on the chalkboard. And we were playing up there one day, and somebody yelled, "Oh, there goes the whaling fleet!" And we all ran over the railing, looked down over Mayflower Bay, and these boats were parading out the lake to go through. Before we had the canal, those boats had to moor in winters down in Oakland and Aberdeen area. Then as soon as the canal opened, then Shoup built the docks in Mayflower Bay, and they were there for years. Yes?
I don't understand.
Oh, yeah. So, anybody else? Yes?
Thank you so much, Mother, for bringing back the live ferry boats on the
Oh, thank you.
We were all born in California, so we didn't get to know how Franklin until, I guess we got the ferry boat for 2 years, and then we retired it. But hearing the stories sort of
Yes.
bringing a good picture of him to us.
Well, I like that picture on the cover of your newsletter because I never thought of him as being dignified, and that picture is quite dignified. But, you know, I said that I lived only 100 yards from the ferry dock. Well, 20 years ago or so, they built a restaurant on the edge of the ferry dock, and they wanted to honor Frank Gilbert, so they built a bronze statue. An artist carved a bronze statue of Anita's uncle. And I would take clients there. I loved to go down there for lunch and brag about, this is where I grew up, and I knew Frank Gilbert, you know, because of the bronze statue. And he had a glass in his hand, too, didn't he? He never turned down.
Money in his pocket and he wrote his foot. And then all the money was donated to charity. So. And if anybody's interested, Nick sold that restaurant. He gave a statue to the present owners who are owners of the Blue Water Bistro, and they just opened a restaurant here on Plain. City of Kirkland Parkland has given us a spot for the statue, but we can't get it back from Dan. He's promised it, but hasn't let it loose yet. So if anybody wants to go there and have lunch.
So what is his name, or what's the restaurant?
His name is Dan Anderson. It's a Blue Water Bistro in Carolina Farm. They opened up where 15 or 15.
And does he have a statue of the restaurant?
Yeah, they have it over on the island in their summer home. It's sitting out in the rain and the weather. I did put a picture in the book of it on that. But Nick, the owner who had the statue built, said, "You better give your guys that statue." I did get a lot of newspaper clippings and photos from Nick, but we didn't get the statue. So we're just encouraging everybody who wants to be on, say, you can look for Dan, say, turn Frank loose. Let him come back home.
I wonder if people in the audience know why there were so many Japanese in Bellevue. It was the truck gardens, didn't they grow produce over there?
Yes.
Strawberries.
Strawberries? Blueberries. Strawberries and blueberries.
The other Japanese boy in the picture there that was sitting below the one that drowned, he still lives near me, and we meet for coffee about once a month in Renton, and we reminisce about the old days in Bellevue. He's about 4 months older. He'll be 90 in August, and I'll be 90 at Christmas time. So we're still friends. And he's my oldest friend now because all my other friends and relatives are gone. I've outlived too many of them.